Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are one of the world's oldest living cultures. Their rich and diverse cultural heritage spans up to about 65,000 years old, and we thank them for protecting and enriching Australian soil through their deep spiritual connection to the land. Indigenous Australians utilise diverse languages, a kinship system, various art forms, and many oral traditions. In Australia, there are around 500 different Aboriginal groups, each with their own language and territory, and are usually made up of a large number of separate clans. Within the Australian justice system, Indigenous Australians are unfortunately overrepresented both as victims and perpetrators. These factors affecting this overrepresentation are due to the historical derived social constructs, cultural dispossession, and systemic biases that exist in a broader socio-historical context of Australian history. It is these issues that bring to light the struggles of Indigenous youth within the juvenile justice systems. Within Australia, there is a prominent history of neglect towards Indigenous youth and the incompetent policies and practices in place to protect them. Now we delve into the historical context of colonisation and how it has overtly impacted Indigenous Australians focusing on their youth. The Royal Commission highlights the more fundamental causes of overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in custody are not to be found in the criminal justice system, but those factors which bring Aboriginal people into conflict with the criminal justice system in the first place. And the most significant contributing factor is the disadvantaged and unequal position in which Aboriginal people find themselves in society, socially, economically, and culturally. Criminal responsibility refers to the system in place to hold individuals accountable for their actions through the criminal law. The differing constructions of childhood in various socio-political contexts creates issues across the juvenile justice system. The criminalisation of children in Australia's juvenile justice system perpetuates systemic issues within Australian society, particularly the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in these systems. The Indigenous juvenile detention rate is 28 times more higher than non-Indigenous. This sheds light on the greater intergenerational economic and social disadvantage experienced by Indigenous Australians. Reports have shown that there is an overrepresentation of Indigenous youth within the juvenile justice system in Australia. Indigenous youth are committing offences at twice the rate of non-Indigenous. However, they are 15.6 times more overrepresented in the juvenile detention. The disparity between these figures are astonishing. So, does Australia have the correct policies in place to protect Indigenous youth? We will discuss this later in the documentary. But for now, we discuss the evidence that also brings up concerns on Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth, and if they are being diverted from justice systems at the same level. This critique of the systems is not to dismiss the issue of Indigenous youth offending. Rather, it proposes ideas surrounding the prevailing unfair treatment of Indigenous Australians. Here, we look at raising the minimum age of criminal responsibility to protect Australian youth. The government's discussion included the doctrine of doli incapax, meaning incapable of guilt, that aimed to protect children ages 10 to 13. However, this doctrine failed to provide equality for young Indigenous children facing the juvenile justice system. In Parliament, Robert Sims discusses the doctrine.
According to the Law Society of South Australia, and I quote from them, the majority of children that come face to face with the criminal justice system have a background of disadvantage and trauma, end quote. This is a system, Mr. President, that is punishing the most vulnerable. Over 50% of children incarcerated are from Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander backgrounds, further adding to the disadvantage that is already faced by these communities.
These young Indigenous Australians are ultimately byproducts of marginalisation and their disadvantaged environment. They are trapped in a system that is working against them and have everyone to blame but themselves. Now we narrow our focus to the Northern Territory's Youth Detention Centre Dondale. This case study captures a holistic representation of the institutionalised racism and abuse in Australia's juvenile justice system. This detention centre had various reports written about it that exposed the barbaric and inhumane treatment of Indigenous children as young as 10. The high levels of critical incidents and abuses the children experienced expose the broken juvenile system and a system that is impetus for change. The detainees were subjected to solitary confinement in brutal conditions. There was no airflow into the unit, which ultimately led to the smell of urine and faeces overtaking the section of the unit. They were practically treated like animals. They were made to eat with their hands and had to request water. They were deprived of the most basic human rights. The conditions were so bad, even the guards of the facility questioned it. So, who were the main perpetrators if the guards weren't? The detainees were taken care of by a prisoner core group that were highly trained in physical fighting. This core group was nothing less but evil. This clip shows the barbaric nature of this group, followed by the discussion between themselves. Don Dale often fabricated the truth to demonise the young Indigenous children. Solicitor Jared Sharp speaks on this.
One of those aspects of this issue that's the most concerning is that there was a deliberate effort to misinform the public about what occurred.
The Vita Review concluded that there were multiple factors that contributed to the violation of human rights at Don Dale. This included a lack of training for staff, inappropriate facilities, and inconsistent management of high-risk detainees. However, the Vita Review discusses these factors as if to say they didn't have the correct facilities to treat the detainees properly. Wrong. There is a moral compass that was lost with these guards, and their treatment of young children is completely unacceptable. A failed youth justice system that has resulted in the abuse of young children. So the question is, who is protecting these young children from injustices? The criminal justice system in Australia functions under a strict framework that mirrors ideologies embedded into Australian society. The glorification of wealth and class within society consequently negates success for young people of lower socioeconomic status. The marginalisation of young Australians based on socioeconomic factors and racial prejudice must end. The Australian government has aided the development and education of Indigenous youth, with councils identifying and targeting Indigenous youth in their formative years. The Close the Gap campaign and the Overcoming Indigenous Disadvantage report aims to minimise the disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians.